a conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near and just passed right through me.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is Back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined once again by Tim Mathews. It has been a minute, Tim, but today we're going to talk about Vertigo, which is a Hitchcock movie, and we have been talking a little back and forth about some of my recent movie watching adventures because I've been doing a lot of older movies lately. But how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I've been doing the same, just finding all sorts of movies that, especially in like the giant movie canon, that is when I think about, oh, that's kind of crazy that I haven't watched that already, and trying to fill in those gaps. So just been hanging and watching movies after movies after movie.
Yeah, I've been getting into movies more lately instead of watching a bunch of TV shows, which was something I did a lot of. Like, I would watch so many TV shows in a given week, and it was just getting to be too much to be that invested in that many different stories for like 6 seasons. So I'm just like, you know what? Movies are nice. You're done in about 2 hours, give or take. And unless it's like Marvel or DC, you don't really have to keep going with anything in particular to get the full story. So that's been nice, but I've been filling in a lot of gaps, and I actually had bought a Hitchcock box set, I want to say like 2 or 3 Black Fridays ago. And I had seen a few of the movies that were included in it, like Psycho, I think, is in it, and North by Northwest. And I had already seen those and maybe 1 or 2 others. But I finally was just like staring at my movie collection and was like, I need to start watching some of these things. And the thing is, like, a lot of the Hitchcock stuff is not streaming as well. So I was like, okay, I'm glad I bought the box set, because like half of the movies are not actually streaming anywhere, at least not on the streaming services that I have. So when I was asking you to do an episode, we were like, all right, we'll do a Hitchcock or a Bond, because I have box sets for both of those. And we landed on Vertigo mostly because I was like, all right, I would prefer to do something I hadn't seen yet, just so I could, cross another one off the list, honestly, kind of selfishly. And
Yeah, definitely.
this is one that is obviously one of his big ones that isn't, Psycho or The Birds. And it felt like it was a huge blind spot for me. And I did not really read up on it going into it, so I had no idea what to expect. But I want to know a little about like what your relationship with Vertigo and Hitchcock in general has been.
Vertigo, I had never watched until this morning, actually.
Okay.
I had a decent amount of random knowledge about it because going through film school, it was obviously used as tons of incredible examples on how to use colors, framing, suspense, twists, just everything that falls into this movie. It's iconic. So over the years, I've had just bits and bits of studying different scenes, but thankfully, it's been years since I was in film school. I was a much younger man, and so I was able to go into this, and as certain things happen, I'm like, oh, okay, I kind of remember like looking at these different scenes, but I could not for the life of me remember knowing the twist. So I was able to still enjoy it on a pretty fresh level. So that was really fun being able to do that. And so I'm right there with you. This was a huge blind spot for me. It just recently was bumped off the #1 of the Sight and Sound list, I believe.
Yeah.
It's obviously, super highly regarded, even though when it first came out, it was not. But I feel like so many of the great films of all time that we look back at, when you look at how they were received when they first came out, a lot of times not so great and not great box office. But for Hitchcock, I definitely, it's just been a sporadic number of different ones that I've seen over the years. Big fan of Psycho. I'd seen The Birds, probably too young. And then I've seen a number of just like different random ones. Just that particular tone, I I've loved how he, crafts a story, and how he's able to work with your expectations and then twist them around. Like, it's, he's obviously iconic, but I will say, like, outside of a handful of his big ones, and then, like, I have some of those, like, Hitchcock Presents books. They're all like the old paperbacks. A lot of them were my dad's. So that's where some of my experience with Hitchcock is. But I also have a lot of blind spots with him, and it's kind of, I feel like he's one of those directors that I was like, yes, he is incredibly highly regarded, and I know that his films are fantastic, and I will get to them. And then so I'm hoping. Probably, I guess, especially after watching Vertigo, I think going into 2023, I'm going to work on knocking out a lot more of those gaps. I have a friend who's a huge fan of Hitchcock, and we've talked a ton of times about just having like different movie nights and doing double features. So I'm looking forward to doing those.
Yeah, I actually have one of those Alfred Hitchcock Presents kind of books. I think the one I have is like stories best read with the door unlocked or something along those lines. And there are a lot of those kind of books, like way more than I realized, because I was recently on Thrift Books or something and just came across a bunch of them, and I was like, wow, I didn't realize there were this many of those kinds of books. Oh, yeah. So the one I have is Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories to be Read with the Door Locked, not Unlocked.
Oh, okay.
That makes more sense. But yeah, and Vertigo is actually based on a book, but it is in French. And I had my friend Becky send me like the pronunciation of it, and then I was like, I'm not even going to try to say that on the podcast.
I was reading a little about that earlier. Yeah.
It basically translates to From Among the Dead. This is according to Wikipedia, so take that with a grain of salt, probably. And it's a mystery novel from 1954. So this was adapted a few years later, and it's just one of those things that I also didn't realize was an adaptation of a book either going into it. So this whole thing is just me finding out a bunch of interesting little tidbits, and they shot it on location, which I think is pretty cool because the Bay Area is definitely like a much different feel than Hollywood or, being on a back lot somewhere. And Mission San Juan Bautista, it's just one of those things where you kind of have these unique settings that are not necessarily impossible to recreate, but it's always better when you can film on location, obviously. And yeah, this initially replaced Citizen Kane on the Sight and Sound list as the top film. And like you said, it just got...
Yeah, it was a big deal. Yeah.
Just got replaced this year. So I didn't even really pay attention to the Sight and Sound list until recently when a bunch of my friends started talking about it, and I was like, oh, this is a thing. So
yeah, it was ramping up, like everyone started talking about it because it was like, oh, the year's coming. And I remember in 2012 when the list came out, but I for all intents and purposes had forgotten about it the same until now, and wasn't really paying attention to the fact that like it's every 10 years. But I'd been seeing in the weeks preceding it, everyone be getting hyped about, oh, what's going to be on the list, and I was like, what the heck, what is this? Because I was initially thinking, I'm like, oh, like the AFI top 100, like that's the one that I was more familiar with.
Yeah, and to dive into the cast a little bit, I mean, the main two are Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak, and Jimmy Stewart is, I think, a little older than I expected in this, and just to see him, sort of going a little gray and like the age difference between him and Kim Novak in the movie, I was like, oh, this is interesting because I wasn't expecting it to sort of almost be Jimmy Stewart playing kind of a creep, honestly, for like a good chunk of the movie too. And I was just like, man, they really made it so his character was being super creepy at times.
It was done very effectively throughout the movie, that it was like, all right, he's following her around and everything, and I get it, he's being like a private eye, and so there was like this feeling of like, this is really creepy, he's stalking her, but I also get he's a private eye, so it's like his job. And so I was like, but I'm assuming it's going to go in a different direction. He's not just going to end up remaining just a cop in it. And the movie itself like has such a dreamlike feel to it. So there, it's really slow paced, but not in a bad way. Like it's like a really effective slow burn as you watch his character, develop down this path.
Yeah, and when you dive into, like you were saying, the fact that he is basically a PI in this, he's a retired cop, and he is going through this trauma of the fellow cop who tried to help save him, ended up falling to his death, and we find out that he has vertigo, hence the title of the movie, and it's this thing where this seemingly friend of his, I guess we'll call him an acquaintance for now, because it's really hard to tell if they were actually friends or not, but you have Gavin Elster, played by Tom Helmore, and he basically wants him to follow his wife because he thinks his wife is in danger. And it turns out that his wife is only in danger because of him. And that it's not even his wife. And that was the thing that I definitely did not see coming with this, because I was like, okay, all of this tracks so far that his wife might be in danger because of reasons that he doesn't really very clearly explain, but it's like, okay, whatever. He'll do this favor for this guy that he clearly has known at least for a little while. And you slowly see Scotty start to fall in love with Madeline. And you have this moment in the movie where you think they're going to just go off and live their life without Gavin in it. And instead, Madeline just bolts off into the bell tower at the mission, and she runs up the stairs. And the one thing that bothered me about this, but I was willing to overlook it, was the fact that he couldn't catch up to her before she even like made it too high up. I was like, this woman is in heels running up some stairs and you, sir, could not catch her? Come on.
Yeah, that there's definitely a level of suspension of disbelief there. I couldn't believe at this point in the movie, like as we're watching this relationship between them build, and so you're thinking, okay, well, this is his supposed friend's wife, and they're getting together. Somewhere down the line, I'm thinking, all right, well, the friend's going to find out. He's not going to be happy about it. And for her to then go up the bell tower, and of course, we see the introduction of the fantastic dolly zoom or the vertigo effect or the Jaws shot. Obviously wasn't the Jaws shot yet, but then for her to go up and then you hear her scream and she falls. I hit my remote and I see that there's like 50 minutes left, and I was like, wait, what? I was like, this feels like a really climactic moment, and I was not expecting to only be halfway through the movie at this point.
Yeah, because it's like 2 hours and 8 minutes or something like that. It's a little over 2 hours, so you still have a good chunk of the movie left, and I don't even think the scream registered in my head at that point in time. Like, it was just one of those things where you assume she has just been taken over again and, kind of blacks out and then kind of like comes to while she's falling, and that explains the scream. But it takes a while for them to sort of unravel the whole thing after that, obviously with 50 minutes left by that point. And I really like how they took their time with that, and they let Scotty sort of go through the motions of him initially believing what we believed, and then he slowly starts to figure it out. Poor Midge in this. Yeah. She's just sort of cast aside. She has some great lines, though. Like, her line delivery was pretty comedic, and I think that helps a lot with some of those tense moments, especially when Scotty's very clearly like in his own head trying to figure things out, and she's just there, which that is one other thing I never understood. He just like lets himself into her apartment all the time, and I was like, this is kind of odd, but okay.
Yeah, because whenever, like at first when he's in there, it feels like we're first introduced to her until the scene plays out and you realize like they're friends and stuff. I'm thinking she's some type of therapist or doctor, even though she's, weirdly standing there painting as he's talking. But
art therapy is a thing.
That's true. That is true. But he's sitting there talking about his recovery, and I'm like, okay, well, maybe I guess she's some kind of doctor. But it's like, no, they're old friends. They were engaged for 3 weeks apparently, and they clearly have this friendship and this playful dynamic. And when his obsession starts to lock in as he's doing his job as a private eye, she gets further and further cast aside, and then the only time he like brings her in is when he needs information, and they go to like the bookstore and stuff. But yeah, she has some fantastic line deliveries, and like, what does she call him, like Johnny Boy?
Johnny O, I think.
Johnny O, yeah, that was it. Yeah, it's just like, ooh, Johnny O.
Yeah, and there's a moment where she pulls up in the car.
That was so good.
And, you have Madeline walking out of Scotty's apartment, and she's just kind of like, oh, Johnny O, what have you done, kind of thing.
Yeah, like, she's married.
Yeah, and it was just moments like that I think kind of broke up a lot of that tension, because everything was so intense too between Scotty and Madeline throughout the whole movie. And even when we then see her as Judy, this is when things got really wild for me with as far as like Scotty's personality.
Yeah,
because he just got so creepy and controlling. And even when they're at this department store or whatever, it's probably not a department store, it looked a little higher end than that, but
where they try on the clothes for you apparently.
Yeah, and you have the woman who's like, oh, he knows what he wants. And it's just like, yeah,
okay.
a little
Different
too
time.
much. He's being super controlling, and just like the way he would grab at that point Judy just like by the arms and like maneuver her where he wanted her to go, I was like, this is way too intense right now. Definitely.
And because after everything happens, like when he first believes that she's dead, and he's essentially like catatonic, as he has to, as he goes through therapy to just kind of like get himself just back into the world. And then you see him out on the street, and then he goes into the restaurant and he thinks he sees her. Then it turns out it's not her. And the shot of that was incredible. There's a moment when she gets up from the table, and I was like, oh my God. I was like, wait, is she really alive? And then the camera like flips and it's somebody else. I'm like, oh no, he's just going a little nuts thinking he's seeing her everywhere. So then when he sees Judy and the face doesn't change throughout this whole time, I'm trying to figure out, I'm like, there's got to be something with her, and could it really be her? But is it somebody else? And then he's just projecting all this obsession and very scary, toxic portrayal as it's getting further and further. And then in the back of my mind, I'm also trying to think, I'm like, well, with the whole thing with Madeline, they played with this whole thing that she was, being overtaken by the old spirit of this woman. And so then there's, in the back of my mind, I'm like, are we still playing with that? Or like, is there still a little bit of this mystical aspect to it? And then as it goes on, you realize like none of the mystical aspects are true, and this guy is just losing his mind. And then when you have the moment where she puts the necklace on, and clearly he starts to realize something. But when I'm thinking back to the movie, I'm trying to think of like, how soon did he know?
Yeah.
And was there a level of, was he pushing this as hard because he just naturally was super obsessive, or and went through kind of these double traumas in this movie, and has he just lost his mind at this point, or did he start to figure it out and just kept pushing and pushing until she would break? And I was trying to think of if there was some level of that.
Yeah, I kind of felt like it was when they were trying on all of the gray suits, and he was like, no, it needs to specifically be this one. And I think it's because he wanted to see if it fit her like the exact same way it had fit Madeline. And then when she had gone to the salon to get her hair dyed and came back and it wasn't styled the right way, it feels like that was kind of just the catalyst for him being like, I know this thing, and I am going to find a way to basically figure out that I am right one way or another. And then it was the necklace that I feel like just convinced him completely that, yes, I'm right. This is the same person.
Yeah, there's no way that you have that necklace that, all right, you look like her. If we changed your hair, you really, really look like her. You have the same measurements. You're able to put on this perfect portrayal of her personality. I was reading about how she so applauded to essentially play 3 different roles in this movie. She plays Madeline, she plays Judy, but there's also Judy projecting what he wants Madeline to be, and these different subtleties that she's able to put in throughout her performance. But there's no level of, he can figure out there's no level of this many coincidences of this person just being exactly able to portray like who I believe, and then have this necklace, and then of course taking her up the bell tower. I did not expect the movie to end there.
Yeah, what an ending too. And I feel like you also have that element of whether or not she wanted him to find out, because we have that scene where she's writing a letter to him being like, oh, I was hoping you would find me. And I think she genuinely wanted him to just like her as Judy at that moment in time, which is why she tore up, crumpled up the letter and got rid of it, because she was playing Madeline. She was not Madeline. She was pretending to be this guy's wife.
Right.
So that wasn't who she really was.
No. She said, don't you like me?
Yeah. And she goes back and forth with him and is like, well, that's not very complimentary.
Right.
You have this struggle with her character where she wants to be seen as herself, not as this person she was paid to pretend to be,
right,
that he fell in love with.
And left with her own trauma of being a murder accomplice.
Yeah. And we find out that, the real Madeline, her neck was already broken, and he just threw her off the bell tower to make it look like it was a suicide. And you have this sequence of events where he knew, because of Scotty's vertigo, that he probably would feel guilty, wouldn't stick around, and he doesn't pay any sort of price for that, in the legal sense. He just goes through all of this trauma all over again. And honestly, considering how little we even see of Gavin Elster in this, he is literally the biggest villain of this story, hands down. And he's maybe in I don't know if he's even in 15 minutes of the movie total. Absolutely.
Yeah, he looms over the entire thing without being on screen almost at all. It's not like he just set up for him to follow, like you initially think, he's just having him follow his wife, and then you're like, I guess, he would naturally be distraught, but he's not gonna blame his friend. But even that, it was just kind of like the way that scene played out, you're like, something's just not right here. This guy just seems oddly calm about the fact that his wife committed suicide.
Yeah.
And that his friend didn't save her. And it's, I'm just gonna wrap up all our affairs and I'm going to go to Europe. I was like, all right, well, that seems weird, but all right, maybe he's just not one to show his emotions.
Yeah.
And then as you find out just how incredibly villainous this whole thing was, and that not only is he paying Judy to portray, Madeline, like she knows that she's part of this whole plot, that it's or at least was unclear to me, like, did she know that this was the whole plan the whole time? It seemed like she had to, because she says to him, I went up to stop him, but she was already dead. And then what's even worse about him being this, incredible villain who basically pulled off the perfect murder, and he gets away with it in the end. There's no consequence for him. And I was actually reading that the studio tried to get Hitchcock to have like an offhanded scene where she hears about him like getting arrested in Europe.
I feel like that would have ruined it, honestly.
Yeah. And Hitchcock apparently like went ahead with it and shot it, but then like convinced him like, no, this is not a good idea. And Jimmy Stewart backed him on numerous different decisions with that, because there was some battle with the darkness and the violence of it. And at this time, you're dealing with the code era.
Yeah.
And so that they were playing with that. And so when you think about how dark and how much of a downer this movie ends on, in the era that it came out, is incredibly impressive.
Right. And we obviously know Hitchcock is good at that, especially with things like this and Psycho and some of his other movies. But with this one, it really felt like this was a deep dive into obsession, not quite in the same way as Psycho, which I liked. Obviously, you can sort of see some patterns with some of his movies, but this one was really just this guy made up this idea of this woman who was pretending to be a different woman in his head. And let's not forget, too, that she was also pretending to be Carlotta at times, too,
right,
when she would go in those sort of blackout fugue states, which obviously weren't really those things happening. She was just pretending to have them happen and pretending to basically be possessed by this dead woman. Yeah. So honestly, Kim Novak does such a good job in this, given the fact that she has to play all of those different characters in those types of roles too. It was just very impressive. And obviously, having been more familiar with Jimmy Stewart already, I wasn't really concerned about what his performance would be like. I was like, it'll be good, he'll play the role exactly as it's supposed to be played. And I think she just really impressed me with how much she had to juggle as Madeline and Judy.
Yeah, she was absolutely phenomenal and just endlessly captivating. Anytime that she was on screen, you can't look away. I mean, she's pulling you in 10 different directions, and you're just utterly fixed on it, which is it's kind of, it's pulls you in with obviously not the creepy obsession level that Jimmy Stewart is, but it's like they handle that so well that you're just like, you're completely in the zone of what he's seeing and his confusion. And anytime you think, I kind of see like where this character might be going, then she pulls you in a different direction. And you're like, well, I'm along for the ride. Like I'm not familiar with her at all. And I even like, I like pulled up the IMDb real quick, and I was just kind of like quick scrolling, and like, I'll have to look up, some of her other works. 'Cause I feel like this was definitely, it seems like my introduction to her.
Same.
And she wasn't even the first choice for the role.
Yeah, that's wild. This movie was so good, though. I had a lot of fun watching it. And, Hitchcock is one of those directors that so many people have talked about, but I was just wanting to kind of do at least one of his movies for the podcast, because, I've talked about so many Marvel movies and DC movies and comics in general and the shows, that it's kind of nice to just dive into this whole other aspect of film that I enjoy, especially with this genre, because obviously you know this, and a bunch of the listeners will know this, that I also really like horror. There are definitely some horrific things, like the nightmare scene in this.
Yeah.
I loved it so much. And it's not that it was scary. It was just the way he used sort of these animations and just playing with the format of the movie for that scene in particular. I just really, really liked that, because we've seen stuff like Creepshow, for instance, where you have the animated stuff kind of bookending the stories, and it's not quite the same because you know that animation is coming. And this, I had no idea. So it just felt like, hey, you really need to pay attention right now. It just pulls you into the movie even more. I do understand that it might take some people out of it, actually, but for me, it definitely had the pulling in effect. And I was like, yes, I need to know what is about to happen, because that was some wild stuff.
Yeah, that's such an incredible scene, and all the stuff that they do with the different animations and everything is actually some of the earliest uses of CGI. Obviously very different than what we interpret as CGI now, but it was all done like through mechanics and computers. It is so incredibly jarring when it happens. You know, as we mentioned earlier, how when she falls off the bell tower and there's all this time left in the movie, the nightmare scene is this like bombastic declaration of like, here's act 2. There's a real slow burn noir feel to the entire movie leading up to this point. And then this is a tonal shift where it becomes a lot more leaning on like psychological thriller, because you're now watching this guy descent into his own madness and obsession, and then the unveiling of a murder plot. Like, it all works as one movie, but with like the tonal shift in it, there's a bit of two going on, but it feels seamless throughout. Like, it doesn't feel like they're trying to do two movies and it doesn't really work. Like, no, this works. That scene was incredible. Even just to mention, the cinematography just in general is just outstanding. And as you mentioned earlier, the use of so many of all real locations and using the Bay Area, and even the mission is all real. But I guess apparently the bell tower, between starting production and filming, the bell tower portion of it had to be torn down because of I forget the reason, but it was like structural. That had to be torn down, so they recreated it and made it even taller using than it was in real life, using matte paintings. But just how everything was shot and lit in this film, I was completely mesmerized throughout. And the use of a bit of 35 millimeter, the use of 70 millimeter, and then they're using Technicolor, which I am such a sucker for. Like, I love anytime I see a movie and it pops up and it says Technicolor or Technicolor Panavision, and I get so excited because I know it has such a distinct, fantastic look to it. I just love how these movies pop. I was completely blown away, and I rented like a 4K restoration version of it on Apple.
Okay. Yeah, I just have the regular Blu-ray set.
I'm sure that looks even great.
Yeah, I have like the LG OLED TV. So,
oh, there you go. Yeah.
So I put a little bit of an investment into my movie and TV watching here.
Excellent.
So even just, the way the green of her dress popped on the screen, it looked so good. And as soon as I turned it on, because I have been watching some older stuff, and I've even watched some like 1920s shorts that Hitchcock did, and they looked terrible because they have not been restored, and they're obviously not in color at that point in time either, but this looked so good.
Yeah, the restoration that they did on this was unbelievable. I was watching on my projector, and so I'm curious your reaction to this scene, the bookstore scene where the lighting gets super dark. I had to rewind because I was watching on a projector and I thought my bulb was starting to go. and then the scene like follows and the light comes back on in the bookstore and I was just like, wait, what the heck? And I was like, let me rewind this. Does it happen exactly the same, or do I need to replace? I have a replacement bulb, and I was like, do I need to swap this out to finish this movie? And so I was reading up on that scene, and tons of people have all different theories on why that was occurring, and that there's the usage of the light outside, and that a cloud goes over, and that there's no actual lights on. I mean, there's some studio lights, but no like in-scene lights actually on in there. But it gets darkened as he's telling like the darkest part of the downfall of Carlotta. But that scene like threw me for a loop. Probably mostly because of how I was watching it. But
yeah, I did notice that it got darker, but it didn't really clock with me. Like, I just assumed that maybe the store was about to close or something. And that's why it was kind of darker in there, because I think just before that, doesn't he ask, like, is it still open or something? Or, can you take me there? And she just, like, immediately leaves. And he's like, well, hold on a second.
Right.
So it kind of felt like she had some sense of urgency to get there. And I was like, is it because it's closing? Like, I couldn't really tell at that point in time because they were in her apartment, like what time of day it was. So I probably was just like, it's, dark in there. Maybe he likes it that way. I don't know. Because like there are some bookstores that you go into and there are like dark sections of the bookstore that they don't have lit up because it's like stuff they're keeping in the back and they don't want people to be confused and like think it's like part of the area where stuff's on sale. Like I've definitely been in used bookstores that are like that. So I guess,
and the way they go down the stairs, it definitely feels like this kind of like this is like a special area of the store.
Yeah. So I think that's just kind of what it felt like to me, but that's a good catch.
Yeah, I was like, oh no.
Yeah, but Tim,
around,
I know we could probably talk movies all day.
Yeah.
Is there anything else, any final thoughts you have on Vertigo? Because I think the nightmare scene was like the one thing I really wanted to make sure we talked about a little. So for me, I just really love this. It's a fantastic film, and I'm glad I watched it.
Yeah, honestly, that's about all I could do is just second that, and that I can't believe it took me this long to finally watch this.
I can believe it took me this long. I'm so bad at watching movies. Like this year, I watched a lot of big things that I feel like people might have just thought I had already seen because of how much horror I've watched for the King podcast that I do and stuff. Like I didn't watch The Thing until this year. Oh,
wow. I came to that one later in my life.
And by this year, I mean literally like a couple months ago, if that. Yeah.
But I mean, the thing is, there's a lot of movies out there. Like there's
so
a lot
many
of movies. So, I always scoff at anyone who's just like, oh my God, like how could you not have ever seen that? It's like, because there's a lot of movies.
And also because I was a big TV person. Like that was what my parents did after work. They would just watch TV. They did buy a lot of DVDs, but it was never any of this kind of stuff. It was a lot of current drama, suspense thriller kind of stuff. And my dad would buy like the Highlander movies. And so it was a bunch of stuff my dad bought that I would probably not end up being interested in aside from like Star Wars. And with my mom, it was just a lot of like drama, suspense kind of stuff that at the time I was not allowed to watch. Right. So that I just kind of didn't really get around to it. And they definitely didn't have any older movies like Hitchcock or anything like that. So now that I finally just have my own money and time and can, watch whatever I want on my TV, it's been like this whole process of going through and watching a bunch of things that I feel like I should have already watched.
Whenever you do discover different movies, it's always exciting to discover something, whether it's something from way in the past, whether it's something new, We all go through life with all of our friends telling us, you got to watch this, you got to watch this, you got to watch this. And you say, yeah, absolutely. And then you forget. But eventually it comes around. So I've been seeing on your pages, on the stories, like when it comes up and it's like you're currently watching something, and it's always cool. I'm like, oh, cool. Like she's watching that. So have fun watching a ton more movies. I know I'm going to continue to do the same. And I'm always happy to come on here and talk movies. It's my favorite thing. So thanks for having me on this and forcing me to finally sit down and watch this absolutely incredible, iconic classic film.
Of course. And, the podcast will mostly retire after the next episode, but I may bring it back whenever I watch something that I really want to talk about. So, Vertigo is definitely one of those kinds of movies. But Tim, thank you again. And to all of the listeners, thank you for listening. We will be back next week with episode 300, which will be all about aliens.